In this 20th lecture, we shall be discussing the research design in case of descriptive and diagnostic research studies. The descriptive and diagnostic research studies are quite different from the exploratory research studies, and this is why we would find that the nature of research design is also different in such kind of cases from the exploratory design, research design in case of the exploratory research which we had discussed in the previous lecture. So, we are aware that the descriptive studies are those studies which are concerned with describing the characteristics of a particular individual or of a group, whereas diagnostic research studies determine the frequency with which something occurs or its association with something else. The studies which are concerned are whether certain variables are associated are examples of the diagnostic research. And studies concerned with a specific predictions, narration of facts and characteristics concerning individuals, groups or situations are all examples of descriptive research studies. So, from the point of view of the research design, the descriptive as well as diagnostic studies share common requirements, and as such these both are grouped together. In descriptive as well as in diagnostic studies, the researcher must be able to define clearly what he wants to measure and must find adequate methods for measuring it along with a clear-cut definition of population he wants to study. Population or universe is a statistical term. What does it mean? It means all the items, all the members who are concerned with the study, with this study. So, if we are working on Indian migrants in GCC countries, then the whole population is 9 million Indian workers in GCC countries. But if we are working on Indians workers in United Arab Emirates, then the population would be say 3.2 or 3.4 million, because as much of Indians are working in United Arab Emirates. If any aspect of the department, then of course the population would be all the students of the department, whereas if we are studying the university, then all the students of the university. So, this is what it says, that in case of both studies, descriptive as well as diagnostic, the population or the universe must be well defined because of the nature of the study. The design in such cases has to be rigid and not flexible, and must focus attention on the following. That is, these are the points which have to be taken care of by the researcher while developing the research design for descriptive and diagnostic research studies. And these are: number one, formulating the objectives of the study. What the study is about? Why is it being made? We have discussed earlier that objectives are a very necessary part of the research. Objectives makes our task easy, makes our task clear, and defines the contours of our work. So, the formulation of the objectives of the study is the first step in research design, which is going to be developed for descriptive and diagnostic type of research studies. Then comes the designing the methods of the data collection. What techniques of gathering data will be adopted? Whether it is going to be observation method, whether it is going to be the interview method, questionnaire schedule method, which method, it depends upon again upon the kind of problem that is at our hand for research. The one way of data collection is not possible for all the type of researches, because if we, and also we cannot have option to be flexible that we will decide it at the time of the stage when it comes for data collection. No, it was possible in the exploratory research studies, but here in the case of descriptive and diagnostic research studies, the researcher has to decide and explicitly design the methods of data collection. Of course, that depends upon the type of study, that depends upon the type of research problem, but then it has to be decided from the very beginning. If we are, say, working on beggars, so it is natural that beggars will not be ready to become respondents to our questionnaire or our schedule, and they may not have time to give interview to us also. So the researcher has to decide which kind of method of data collection one has to do. He may decide that the observation method is the best method for collection of data in case of a study which is related to beggars. But it may not always be true. If we are working on, say, school living children, then on observation will not do. We will have to have the collection of data from the either questionnaire or schedule. Or suppose if we are working on, say, migrant birds, then also, because they are every year in the winter they migrate from Siberia in millions, and there are researchers, many researchers, who have done very excellent studies regarding them. So, if it is so, again we have to decide which kind of the collection of method of collection of data is going to be adopted for such studies. And if it is so, then again what kind of the observation method, because observation method also has many types. So this has to be decided in advance in the by the researcher while he develops the research design of his problem of study. Then comes the sample. How much, what should be the size of the sample? How much sample is going to be collected? How much individuals, items are to be included in the sample? This, in such kind of researches, the researcher has to in fact decide it from advance. From advance, he has to, the research or she has to decide on the sample, and also which type of sampling method they have to adopt, the researcher has to adopt, has also to be decided from the very beginning. Whether it is non-random sampling or random sampling or a mixture, pure random sampling or a mixture of the two, that has to be decided by the researcher in advance. Because if he does not decide in advance, then in such type of cases he has no option to be flexible and decide at the time of the collection of the data. No. Which type of data collection method, which type of or size of the sample has to be adopted, that is to be decided from the very beginning, and that has to be a part of the research design in case of such kind of researches which we are discussing, that is descriptive and diagnostic research studies. Then also the designing of the methods of data, the collection of the data, where can the required data be found and with time period should the data be related. The time period in such cases are such types of research are also necessary to be defined, because we cannot study for very long periods of time, and even if we study, then it is the policy implications will not be as suitable, because if we work on the recent 10 years or 20 years, what has been happening with the phenomena, then of course one can have, the conclusion that arrives would be a kind of very useful conclusions for the policy making. Suppose if we are working on the school living children, if we go on working what has happened since our independence, then it is a very, very long period of time. And it may not capture perfectly what is happening, say, in recent years, what has been happening. Policy recommendation or the policies have to be developed on the basis of these researches. And if we fix the period, then it is of course very useful. So the period has to be fixed, time period. Since when we are going to study India Iran relations, or since when we are going to study India China relations or India Saudi Arabia relations, that has to be demarcated logically, of course, for the setting up of the research design, and where the required data can be located. That is also important, that the required data is located at the appropriate place. The location of the data is very important in such kind of the descriptive and diagnostic research studies, because the phenomenon to be studied has to be related with the place where the phenomenon is happening. So the location of the data and the the time period selection are very important. And then the processing and analyzing of the data has to be decided from early in the design itself. How the data is to be processed, how the data is to be analyzed, which kind of a statistical instrument we are going to adopt to analyze our data, how the report would be written. These are the questions which have to be replied in developing the research design such studies by the researcher. Then in this descriptive or diagnostic study, the first step is to while designing the data collection procedure, adequate safeguards against bias and unreliability has to be ensured. As we have discussed in the previous lectures, that the research has to be free of bias. It has to be reliable as much as possible. And this is why while designing the data collection procedure, the safeguard has to be taken against bias and unreliability. And this is why the surveyors are trained in any scientific investigation, so that they may collect the data being totally neutral and may not be influenced by their own perception, by their own thinking. And of course, the data's reliability has to be ensured, because if there is bias in collection of the data and if there is no reliability, then of course our research is going to suffer from unlimited unlimited problems, and face the wrong results and conclusions. So the the design has to ensure that the bias and unreliability is reduced to minimum. Again, it is always desirable to pretest the data collection instruments before they are finally used for study purpose. In other words, we can say that structured instruments are used in such studies. So, if we have developed a questionnaire, so this questionnaire has to be first pre-tested so that its limitations are very clear in the pre-testing. The pre-testing is done on a very limited basis to know the problems of, say, the questionnaire. So that questionnaire has to be put to the pre-test so that the limitations that is suffered by the questionnaire is removed by the experience in the pre-test, and they are improved in that light. This is why these are called the structural instruments. The descriptive diagnostic research studies requires structured instruments for the data collection, and that has to be ensured by the research design itself. In most of the descriptive and diagnostic studies, the researcher has to take out samples and then wishes to make statements about the population on the basis of the sample analysis. More often than not, sample has to be designed. What do we mean by this? Because in this kind of studies, many times we have to draw sample from the population, and if the sample drawn does not represent the characteristic of the population, then what would happen? The inference that would be drawn from this sample to be generalized for whole of the population would be defective, because the sample was not representative of the population, and this is why the generalization of the results of the sample for whole of the population will not be suitable. It will be leading to long results, and this is why in the design itself the researcher has to design the sample design in such a way that the sample is truly representative of the population, and the generalizations of the findings and conclusions of the sample is without any inhibition done for the whole of the population, and this reflects the true characteristic of the population also. And this is why the sample design has to be very clearly designed for such cases of descriptive and diagnostic researches. Again, to obtain data free from errors introduced by those responsible for collecting them. It is necessary to supervise closely the staff of field workers as they collect and record the information. Because after all, these staff may not be fully trained, may not have taken the training seriously, or they may get influenced by their own thinking on biases and preferences. So, it is very necessary for the researcher that the surveyors who collect the data for the phenomenon are under a strict watch and supervised very closely, so that there the errors coming from them are controlled. Then also the researcher has to develop a design which can be ensure the data collecting staff perform their duty honestly and without prejudice. As data are collected, they should be examined for completeness, comprehensibility, consistency and reliability. These are the characteristics that has to be implemented for collection of the data. The data collected has to be processed and analyzed. These includes steps like coding, interview replies, observation, etc., etc., tabulating the data and performing several statistical computations. A good research design of descriptive and diagnostic research studies must have clearly, in clear terms, explained and defined the processes, the processing methods, the coding and the other methods of the data, and of course the statistical methods which should be adopted. So the processing of the data has to be decided in the, and of course the in the design itself. It cannot be flexible to be adopted, that we adopt, the researcher adopts it whatever way he wants at the time of the after the collection of the data. It has to be rigid and it has to be defined from the very beginning in the research design itself. The accuracy of the tabulation have to be checked also by having a sample of tables redone. In case of mechanical tabulation, the material must be entered on appropriate cards, which is usually done by the computer operators. This has to be, the tabulation has to be also done accurately, and this again will have to be explained in the research design. And similarly, the probability and sampling analysis also have to be used. The appropriate statistical operations along with the use of appropriate test of significance has to be carried out to safeguard the drawing of conclusions concerning the study. What does it mean? It means that the statistical design has to be decided, has to explain what kind of statistical analysis is appropriate for this the type of research that the researcher has undertaken, so that the drawing of conclusions from the sample is very appropriately generalized for whole of the population. Further, the research design in case of descriptive and diagnostic studies is a kind of comparative design throwing light on all points narrated above and must be prepared keeping in view the objectives of the study and the resources available. However, the researcher has to ensure minimization of bias and maximization of reliability of the evidence collected, without which the, the research cannot be very proper. The design has to take account all steps involved in survey concerning the phenomenon that we are going to, or the researcher is going to study. So, what we found here in case of descriptive and diagnostic research studies, that the design has no flexibility and there is no option of delaying the decision at the time of implementation of the research problem. But in this type of research, every aspect of the research has to be well stated, well defined in advance in the research design. What we have discussed in earlier in this lecture is summarized in this table for the which explains the design or in a very concise way for the design for the descriptive and diagnostic research studies. The overall design has to be rigid. That what is that? It has to make enough provision for protection against bias and must maximize reliability. The sample design has to be random sampling, probability sampling design. It cannot be non-probability sampling design, which is left to the decision of the researcher. No, it has to be designed. It has this sampling design has to be decided from the very beginning, and which would be one of the probability sampling designs and would be selected. There are various kind of probability sampling designs. Which of them is to be decided by the researcher. Again, for the statistical design, there is pre-planned design for the analysis, the how to analyze, which formulas to use. These are all decided from the very beginning in the research design for such studies in advance. Of course, it would depend on the nature of the problem, that which kind of analysis has to be adopted, but it has to be decided in the very beginning, from the very beginning in the design itself. Then the observational design, it has to be structured, well thought out instruments for the collection of data. It is not left again to the researcher to decide at the time of exactly observation. No, it has to be well planned from the very beginning and totally mentioned what kind of the instrument we are going to use for the collection of the data. Whereas the operational design is that advanced decisions, all decisions have to be taken in advance about the operational procedures. This is a, a very summarized or concise way of knowing what is the research design in case of descriptive and diagnostic research studies. But we must remember that in this kind of studies, the overall design has to be rigid, and all the design has to be in fact developed and not left to be decided at the time of real implementation of the research, but the design has to be developed, and then the research would proceed according to this design. Thank you very much. I am sure that I have been able to explain this to you in and I have been able to make it clear what the research design in case of the descriptive and diagnostic research studies should be. Thank you again.